Just 2 days before the G20 summit, after a grand welcome in Jakarta, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the 20th ASEAN India Summit. PM Modi said that India and ASEAN both have historical and geographical links. He added that he is confident that during the discussions, new measures will be taken to strengthen the India-ASEAN future. Listen in.
हमारी हिस्ट्री और ज्योग्राफी भारत और आसियान को जोड़ते हैं। साथ ही साझा वैल्यूज, क्षेत्रीय एकता, शांति, समृद्धि और मल्टीपोलर वर्ल्ड में साझा विश्वास भी हमें आपस में जोड़ता है। भारत की एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी का केंद्रीय स्तंभ है। भारत आसियान सेंट्रलिटी और इंडो पैसिफिक पर आसियान के आउटलुक का पूर्ण समर्थन करता है। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, आज वैश्विक अनिश्चितताओं के माहौल में भी हर क्षेत्र में हमारे आपसी सहयोग में लगातार प्रगति हो रही है। यह हमारे संबंधों की ताकत और रेजिलियंस का प्रमाण है।
PM Modi is participating in the ASEAN India Summit along with other heads of states or governments of the ASEAN member states. PM Modi is further taking part in the 18th East Asia Summit. Now, the East Asia Summit will bring together the ASEAN members and 8 dialogue partners. These include Australia, China, India, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, Russia and the United States. The focus of the summit will be on the situation in Myanmar 2 years after the military coup, as well as Beijing's growing aggression in the South China Sea. For more on this, we are now joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddhant Sibbal, live from New Delhi. Siddhant, if you can hear me clearly, I would like to ask you first up, where do India-ASEAN relations stand? Well, in light of the upcoming G20 summit, what possible measures to further strengthen ties can we expect post the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Jakarta?
Well, the Indian Prime Minister has attended both the East Asia Summit and the India-ASEAN Summit. And the fact that the Indian Prime Minister chose to go to Indonesia just one day before the G20 Summit here in Delhi as the host, he will be welcoming many leaders, shows the priority India accords to the ASEAN grouping. Of course, India's focus to ASEAN comes via the Act East policy of the Indian government. And that, of course, emphasizes on greater connectivity and people-to-people engagement. But essentially, we saw what the Prime Minister said, and there was a strong emphasis on ASEAN centrality, on the Indo-Pacific, and how, of course, both India and ASEAN can work together at a time of great geopolitical changes. We know that this meeting, these summits are coming in the backdrop of increasingly aggressive China. And interestingly, something I can point out is that when the map controversy broke, the Chinese came up with new map. We saw how India was the first to react, and following India, we saw several members of the ASEAN grouping, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Vietnam, coming out strongly against China over its new map, which claims their territory.
Siddhant, when you talk of China, well, I also want to ask you about Washington. Now, the 18-nation member meeting brings Washington and Beijing into contact a day after Premier Li Qiang warned major powers that they must manage the differences to avoid a new Cold War. Now, will this meet be a fiery affair due to the differences between these major powers, you think?
Well, I do not think anything major or breakthrough is expected to happen when it comes to ASEAN meetings and China and United States. Now, we know that the last meeting at the leaders level US President Joe Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping happened on the sidelines of the Bali summit in Indonesia. And since then, hopes were high that the next meeting could happen here in Delhi. Now, the Chinese president is skipping without giving a reason why he's not coming to Delhi. And we know when it comes to ASEAN, the representation level is by Premier Lee and by the US Vice President. Now, so far, there haven't been any details as to if there was a conversation between the two sides. But essentially, the trajectory of relationship between China and the United States remain as they are with other countries China has, whether it's with India, ASEAN, Japan. It has been a relationship that has number of challenges with increasingly aggressive China. And essentially, while the Chinese might be saying that it's a new Cold War, many would blame Beijing for the current crisis in the Indo-Pacific and the wider world.
Right. Let's also shift focus to another rather troubled area. Now, the ASEAN has led diplomatic attempts to resolve the festering crisis in Myanmar, but its efforts so far have failed to stem the bloodshed unleashed by a military coup in 2021. Now, can we say that the bloc is at crossroads, and how does it intend to deal with these regional emergencies?
Well, Myanmar remains a worry for the ASEAN grouping. Now, ASEAN has proposed a 5-point agenda just after the coup that happened in the country. But since then, there hasn't been any progress. ASEAN has been calling for making sure that the opposition, that's Aung San Suu Kyi, the focus being from the ASEAN side that she should be released. But nothing sort of that has happened by the junta in Naypyidaw. And essentially, when it comes to Myanmar, we know that ASEAN has decided that the country, as member of the grouping, will not be hosting the summit in 2026. So essentially, a strong message being sent by ASEAN to Myanmar, but highly unlikely that Myanmar is going to change its track. The junta is going to change its track. In fact, there was a strong condemnation by the Myanmarese authorities over the ASEAN decision that Myanmar will not be hosting the summit. So essentially, both sides, the ASEAN grouping and Myanmar, are expected to remain loggerheads. But how strong or willing the ASEAN grouping will be to take stronger action against Myanmar is something that will be closely watched.
Now, talking about the other things that could be on the agenda during these meetings. Now, the ASEAN members are holding bilateral meetings with India, Australia and the UN on Thursday. Now, if you could just tell us more about what's lined up on that front.
Well, many of these meetings have happened. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister addressed the India-ASEAN Summit. So I can give you a basic overlay of what happens during ASEAN Summit. So ASEAN basically not only holds its summit, the 10-member grouping, but it also has various formats with countries like India, with Japan, with South Korea. There's a trilateral meeting as well. There are different formats, and East Asia Summit is the last of these series of summits that ASEAN hosts every year. Now, East Asia Summit invites countries like Russia, US, China, India under the same roof. So essentially that provides platform for conversation not only within ASEAN but with the wider region as well. Now we know that focus has been for many of these countries from India to US on ASEAN centrality. That basically means that when it comes to ASEAN, that remains as a bloc, and its stability, its unity is something all these countries have been emphasizing on. But essentially when it comes to increased Chinese aggressive actions, will this ASEAN centrality be buzzword is something that many would like to ask. We know that when it comes to China, it has been trying to have its own deals with many of the ASEAN countries. Will that work? Because that's usually the Chinese format of conversation. So these are important bilaterals that will perhaps help in having more stable region.
Right. Thank you so much, Siddhant, for giving us those updates and detailed ones as well. Thanks for joining us.